We are now 153 days away from the midterms, and after one of the busiest primary days of the year, they're still counting ballots in the state of California. But here's what we know tonight. Republican Steve Hilton and Democrat Xavier Becerra are leading the race to replace outgoing Governor Gavin Newsom. Incumbent Karen Bass has advanced to the runoff in the hotly contested Los Angeles mayor's race, and on November 3rd, she will face either former reality star Spencer Pratt, a Republican or progressive Nitya Raman, who is on LA's city council. Also last night, Trump's endorsement streak ended in the state of Iowa. Congressman Randy Feenstra lost the Republican gubernatorial primary, which means Zach Lane will face Democrat Rob Sand in November. See, there's a lot that was happening last night. So let's bring in our nightcap. David Gura joins us. No Tie, host of Bloomberg This Weekend and the Big Take podcast. Tim O'Brien joins us. Bloomberg Opinion, senior executive editor and Trump biographer. Lizzie O'Leary, host of What Next? TBD, Slate's podcast about tech, power, and the future. And MS Now contributor Richard Stengel. He's a former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, as well as a former managing editor for Time magazine. David, what stood out to you about last night, beside the fact that those who covered it had to stay up really late?
Had to stay up very late and work through the morning, and still we don't know the results of these races in California.
Not because they're broken, reminder. It's because this is how California operates.
Well, I personally am just fascinated by the way that these elections play out in California, the kind of craziness of having all of these candidates and the top two ones move on. And for me, I was most interested in this mayoral race in Los Angeles, in part because Mr. Heidi Montag was involved in it. A lot of excitement surrounding that for me. But look, I think it was a race where I was a fan of the Hills.
You were?
Yeah. He has a burgeoning crystals business.
He does.
Crap Daddy Crystals.
He does.
Let me get that out there.
More about that in Block B.
Sure,
Yes.
Block B. I'll take off another article of clothing besides the tie. Look, I think that it showcases the fact that there is kind of broad dissatisfaction with politics at the national level. But as he and the other candidates have brought up, there are still local issues that are animating voters. And I think that's what stood out to me, the fact that, yes, there are issues we're all grappling with, cost of living, high fuel prices, but homelessness is something that really animated that race in Los Angeles.
I would just like to say that David Gura hosts his own podcast and television show 2 days a week, and there is no chance on Bloomberg he has told that audience that he once watched The Hills. Good on MS. Okay, Lizzie, it has been more than 20 years since an incumbent mayor of Los Angeles has faced a runoff. What does that say about the message voters are sending? And is the situation with the fires in LA, is that what makes this so unique?
I mean, I think the fires were such a devastating, world-shifting event for so many people and so many swaths of people in LA. Like, it wasn't one place. It wasn't one demographic group. You have all sorts of people who were affected, and Karen Bass was not on the scene in those first moments, and people were really angry about that. I, as a former Hills viewer, also find the Spencer Bass thing, I'm outing myself, just completely bonkers, but I guess that's where we are right now, like one reality show star to another one. I don't know. It feels completely deranged, but A, LA is complicated, and B, California, I love you, is the Crystals reality show guy. Like, it's not that surprising that California is going for someone a little bit wacky.
Okay, but California is Crystals wacky. His crystals are grifter wacky.
Yeah.
Okay, that's different from being a crystals type of person. Yeah. But just talk about that for a moment, because it's not uncommon for people to say, I want something different. I'll take a newcomer. I'll take an outsider. But in the case of Spencer Pratt, he's got some big financial backers. And this guy, besides saying, this sucks, let's do something else, hasn't articulated any policy proposals, nor does he understand government. And he's not even getting a lot of flack for that. Think back to New York City when Mamdani was running and people were outraged, saying this guy doesn't know government. He's not prepared for it.
Well, he could probably be president, however, now, because we have somebody sitting in the White House who got there doing exactly the same thing. You know, I think there's mail-in ballots that are going to be counted till Friday. I'll probably get in trouble saying this, but I imagine both Bass and Becerra will be just fine come Friday.
Really?
Yeah. I think there's, I think those will be coming in on their side of the ledger, and so I think it's a little early to read some tea leaves in this. And it's just that's all. Those races are always hard to wait out in California, but they take a few days to settle. It's a deep blue state, and Los Angeles is a deep blue city. And I don't think Steve Hilton's going to be the governor. And he's another version of Pratt. I mean, you have, Trump has opened the door to performance artists who are unqualified, not only running for governor or mayor, but being, the director of national intelligence and being the war secretary and being the commerce secretary. And everyone now knows that if you can connect viscerally on social and over the airwaves, and you tell people you're on their side, that gets you often like 90% of the way. And that's one of the reasons we are in a bad place, I think, in the country, because we're putting performance above policy.
Let's go to Iowa, because the Trump-backed candidate for governor lost to a political newcomer. And it's interesting because the president, his endorsements have been quite strong. Why was Iowa different?
I actually think Iowa is different. I'm dating myself when, remember the book, What's the Problem with Kansas? And this idea that Tom Frank wrote it, and this was 2004, 2005, that voters, Democratic voters, working class voters, were voting against their own interests because they had been seduced by cultural things. And look, I always believe it's the economy, stupid, ultimately. But the newcomer who won, he's more moderate. The Trump endorsement came late. I think there's a kind of rationalism that's setting in. I've spent so much time in Iowa in various campaigns, the Bradley campaign.
I was 22. I was just carrying signs around.
At the Fort Des Moines Hotel. I think 6 weeks in the Fort Des Moines Hotel. But I've always thought Iowa is really a kind of a blue state in hiding, and that it's actually more liberal and more moderate than it gets credit for. And I would hope that someday, Iowa would come back into the bluish column. So maybe that's my, not explicit explanation of it.
Oh. Well, also his coattails were it was in deep South states and Indiana, which votes like a deep South state, and that's where he entered and cashed in his endorsement. But remember, all that was preceded by the Virginia and New Jersey votes, and now the Iowa vote. And I don't think Trump has national coattails. I think they've burned all the way up to his waist.
Oof. Let's talk about Zach Lane, because this guy was supported by the Make America Healthy Again movement, the advocates. Do you see that group, Lizzie, becoming, a bigger player in November?
I think that group is this really heterogeneous, weird thing where sometimes it is moms, right? The sort of Instagram maha moms who may have gone from crunchy on the left to crunchy on the right. But I also think their allegiances shift. They care about a small number of issues. They care about their kids, but they don't like images of children in ICE custody. They don't like images of violence. They are not MAGA diehards. They're just sort of in this, I guess, a slightly feminized version of the just asking questions moment. And I'm not sure that they're a solid voting bloc in the same way, especially when people like Casey Means kind of fall on their face. I don't know. It doesn't feel like there are a tremendous amount of political legs there.
Last night, the Supreme Court cleared the way for Alabama to use redrawn maps. This is the 10th state to do this. How much of a factor do you think that's going to be in the midterms?
A huge one. And I think when that decision came down a couple of weeks ago, it was clear almost immediately it was going to have a huge effect on the midterms and elections after that. So I think we're beginning to still just reckon with what it's going to mean. But, of course, the prelude to that decision was the fight that we'd seen play out, the war that we'd seen play out over these congressional districts in many states across the country. I think an animating question for me is, how does that end? Are we entering a world in which there are no kind of contested districts across the country? It seems like we're getting there. But yes, in Alabama, Louisiana, I think those populations are reckoning with the fact that the electoral map is going to look radically different than it has for the last several decades.
All right, I have a new topic, and I feel like you all might want to weigh in. Several Trump cabinet officials appeared before Congress today. There was a lot there were many sound bites I wanted to pull and dissect, but specifically Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He was asked about the president's stock trades, which were disclosed last month. We've talked about them a lot here, and I want to share his response.
President Trump is not sitting in the Oval Office engaging in a high-frequency trading strategy. Clearly, he had an outside manager who was doing that, and I think it's incumbent upon both houses of Congress to get their house in order before you move to the administrative branch.
Well, that's the same line that J.D. Vance used, and no one's saying that Donald Trump has got his Vanguard account open. And he's sitting in the Oval Office.
That's a nonsense response.
And it's an evasion because I think there's two things. The Trumps all have advisors they speak to who execute trades for them.
Yeah.
And secondly, all of those trades occurred around times when there were significant policy changes that affected the valuation of the stocks. And Trump does not have meaningful blind trust set up around his business. He shouldn't have any money being traded on his behalf in an account while he's sitting in the Oval Office. Business journalists forever haven't owned individual shares of stock in the interest of never having a reader say, oh, you wrote that story because you own a Microsoft share.
Think about all the restrictions on CEOs or officers of any publicly traded companies.
And Scott Bessent, of all people, knows this. He was a money manager.
But that's why his response is so disingenuous.
Well, and it's so glib and it's unethical, and it is another indication of what happens to the people in the Trump orbit who so badly want to have a job working for him to either enrich themselves or pad their resumes at the expense of being ethical and competent managers, that they then go in front of Congress and sort of treat it lightly, like, oh, come on, the idea that President Trump is trading stocks all day, and that was the response that J.D. Vance had weeks ago. So they're all getting the same talking points, and it's garbage.